Dark clouds gather over the skies of Massachusetts. April 1775. The skies over Massachusetts carried the weight of a world about to change. The last snow of the season hadn't fully melted, leaving scattered white patches across the barren fields outside Boston. Cold winds swept over the hills blanketed with oaks and pines, bringing the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and unrest. For months now, the colonists had stopped believing in the fairness of the British crown. They had been patient. They had petitioned, protested peacefully, and reasoned. In return, they received harsher laws, more warships docking in their harbors, and more red-coated troops patrolling their streets with heavy boots and loaded muskets. Boston, once a vibrant port city, had become a pressure cooker. British soldiers were everywhere. Local citizens no longer dared to gather in groups larger than 3. Conversations were whispered, every glance was cautious. Every shadowed alley could lead to arrest. In low-ceilinged taverns and kitchens lit by firewood, people whispered of what was coming. Rumors traveled faster than spring storms. British soldiers would seize weapons. They would arrest patriot leaders. They would crush any sign of rebellion with force. Amid this storm rose the defiant figures of Samuel Adams and John Hancock, 2 men whom the Crown had labeled dangerous traitors. Adams, with his sharp eyes and determined voice, was the thinker. Hancock, a wealthy young aristocrat whose signature would one day dwarf all others, used his fortune and status to support the cause of resistance. On the other side stood General Thomas Gage, a seasoned officer of the British Empire now tasked with suppressing a colony on the edge of revolt. Gage had once hoped to bring order through diplomacy, but after the infamous Boston Tea Party of 1773, where tons of East India Company tea were dumped into the harbor, he knew peace had slipped away like the tide. Pressure from King George III bore down on his shoulders. Control Boston. Arrest the traitors. Disarm the rebels before this fire spreads. Meanwhile, in countryside towns like Lexington, Concord, and Salem, people were preparing not for a new season of harvest, but for the unspoken possibility of war. The Minutemen, local militia trained to respond within a minute, drilled daily in open fields. They practiced with old muskets, fired from behind stone walls, learned to move silently through forests, and signaled with lanterns or the blast of a horn. These weren't professional soldiers. They were carpenters, blacksmiths, schoolteachers, preachers, shepherds, and farmers. But there was fire in their eyes, the fire of dignity, of righteous anger that had been stoked for years. A secret cache of arms was quietly established in Concord. Gunpowder, shot, muskets, and bayonets were hidden in barns, under churches, even buried beneath the soil. Women joined the cause, sewing flags, molding lead bullets from spoons, cooking for militia gatherings, and teaching children how to stay safe when the British came. News traveled fast, though not with telegraphs or newspapers, but through whispered words, handwritten notes, and the pounding hooves of riders. One early April night in a smoky tavern outside Salem, an elderly man stood up, raised his mug, and shouted above the din, "If the king's men come to take our weapons, let them taste colonial steel. We are no longer subjects. We are Americans." Cheers erupted, mugs clinked, but in the corners worried eyes watched. War, true war, would mean no turning back. On April 14, 1775, General Gage received secret instructions from London. Capture Adams and Hancock. Confiscate the military stores in Concord, immediately. Gage understood the risk. The countryside teemed with opposition. An open march would stir resistance. So he devised a plan for a stealthy nighttime operation. No drums, no flags, no fanfare. Just speed and surprise. The mission would involve 700 British regulars, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith and Major John Pitcairn, both experienced officers, but unfamiliar with the wild terrain and fierce resolve of New Englanders. They were to leave Boston by nightfall on April 18th, cross the Charles River quietly by boat, then march through Cambridge and Menotomy, arriving in Lexington and Concord by dawn. But they did not know they were being watched. In a silversmith shop in Boston, Paul Revere, an alert craftsman and member of the Sons of Liberty, was working late when a trusted friend leaned close and whispered, They're moving tonight, across the river, heading for Concord. Revere didn't hesitate. He slipped a letter into his coat, grabbed his riding cloak, and dashed for the docks. A small rowboat waited. They silently crossed the dark Charles River like phantoms on black water. On the far side, his white mare stood ready. Revere mounted and began his legendary midnight ride, a journey that would echo through centuries of American memory. Through the pitch-black countryside, he galloped from Medford to Lexington, knocking on doors, rousing entire households, and summoning militias with breathless urgency. The regulars are coming. Rise up, be ready! Across New England, lanterns were lit in the night. Men donned their leather coats, strapped on powder horns, and stepped into the cold with muskets in hand. Boys raced across fields to spread the word. Church bells rang, drums beat, and signal fires were lit atop hills. A storm had been foretold, and now the people were ready to meet it. The race of the Midnight Riders on the night of April 18, 1775. The skies over Massachusetts were pitch black, no moon, no stars. A strange silence blanketed Boston, as if the land itself was holding its breath. But beneath that hush, orders had been given. A secret march was about to begin. From the banks of the Charles River, small British boats slid silently through the dark waters. There were no drums, no flags, only loaded muskets, bayonets, and the cold stares of men trained for war. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith led more than 700 regular troops, tall men in red coats and heavy boots, marching in perfect formation like a machine of war. Their mission, to reach Concord and seize a hidden cache of rebel weapons. But they were already too late. From the steeple of the Old North Church, 2 lanterns had been lit, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. It was the agreed-upon signal of the Sons of Liberty. Paul Revere was waiting at the river's edge. The moment the lanterns were visible, he leaped onto his beloved horse, a swift white mare borrowed from Dr. John Larkin, and galloped into the night, beginning a ride that would become legend. It would be remembered forever as the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Revere wasn't alone. Earlier that evening, another rider, William Dawes, had set out from Boston via the land route through Roxbury. Though his path was longer, Dawes was resourceful and knew the terrain. Both men shared the same mission: warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock in Lexington of the impending British march and alert the militias of nearby towns. From Medford to Arlington, Paul Revere pounded on doors, shouting, "The regulars are out! Wake up!" To arms, he didn't say, "The British are coming," because at the time, everyone still considered themselves British. He used the term regulars to refer specifically to British troops. Candlelight flared to life behind windows. Men jumped out of bed, throwing on coats, grabbing muskets, blowing horns, and beating drums. The alarm spread like wildfire. In Lexington, the small house where Adams and Hancock were sleeping remained quiet. Revere arrived just before midnight. He knocked urgently, calling out, "Mr. Hancock! Mr. Adams, wake up, they're coming for you." A servant opened the door. Minutes later, the 2 Patriot leaders stood in their nightclothes, stunned by the news. Samuel Adams, after a pause, spoke softly. "God has called us to this hour. May we be ready?" As Adams and Hancock began preparing to evacuate Lexington, Revere and Dawes pressed onward toward Concord. Along the way, they were joined by a third rider, a young physician named Dr. Samuel Prescott, who happened to cross their path and pledged to help. 3 men, 3 horses, 3 hearts pounding with urgency, rode through the cold night, across fields, forests, and the thin veil of fear. But the British were not blind. A patrol had been sent ahead to intercept any alarm riders. Near the town of Lincoln, the trio fell into an ambush. Dr. Prescott reacted quickly, veering his horse off the road, leaping over a stone wall, and escaping into the woods. William Dawes also managed to flee, though he lost his horse and was forced to turn back. Paul Revere, however, was captured. A British officer leveled his pistol at him and barked, "Your name, sir?" "What are you doing here?" Revere did not flinch. With a gravelly but firm voice, he said, "My name is Revere. I have alarmed the country. If you're heading for Concord, you will not go unnoticed." The redcoats escorted him back toward Lexington. But along the way, Revere caught sight of something that made his heart swell: militia gathering in the fields, campfires glowing, weapons being readied, trumpets being tuned. The revolution was awakening. Even if he had been caught, the mission was a success. Meanwhile, Dr. Samuel Prescott became the unsung hero of the night. He was the only one of the three to reach Concord before dawn. He alerted local commanders, who quickly moved weapons to safer locations, dispersed their forces, and prepared for the worst. In every town he passed, Lincoln, Acton, Bedford, church bells rang out, calling men to arms. From farms, workshops, and dirt paths, hundreds of Minutemen made their way toward Concord. None knew exactly what would happen, but all understood that if they didn't rise today, there might never be another chance. By the early morning of April 19th, a small band of about 70 militiamen had assembled in Lexington under the command of Captain John Parker. A thin, weathered man with cloudy eyes, Parker was a veteran of earlier frontier wars. Now he stood quietly before his ragtag line of farmers and tradesmen. Down the eastern road the British were advancing, a long line of red snaking slowly through the fog. The soldiers had no idea that the countryside was awake. A human network of riders, bonfires, and courage had turned their secret march into a slow, visible procession. Paul Revere may have been captured, but his spirit and the determination of riders like Dawes and Prescott had already spread like the wind. To ride through the night was more than an act of urgency. It was a declaration, a vow to freedom. The first counterstrike, made not with gunfire, but with speed, bravery, and unwavering loyalty to a cause greater than themselves. As the New England sun rose that morning, its first rays did more than light the misty fields. They lit the pages of history. Every hoofbeat of the riders from April 18th had stirred a sleeping nation. They carried no swords or armor, only the torch of warning. And because of them, Massachusetts was ready for the first shots of a revolution. The Battle of Lexington. The first shot dawn had barely broken over the peaceful countryside of Lexington. On April 19, 1775, when the first ripples of war would forever change the course of American history. The air was thick with anticipation, the sky tinged with hues of gray and gold as the town stirred awake. But this was no ordinary morning. By then, riders had already swept through the region, their hooves thundering over dirt paths to warn of an approaching British force. In the quiet village of Lexington, Captain John Parker stood with a grim face outside the Buckman Tavern, where most of his men had gathered for warmth. Parker, a veteran of past wars and suffering from tuberculosis, understood the weight of the moment. Though his breath was labored and his shoulders weary, his eyes were sharp as ever. Around him stood 77 members of the local militia, farmers, blacksmiths, schoolteachers, all citizens turned soldiers overnight. They were the Minutemen, so named for their ability to mobilize at a minute's notice. Some were boys barely into manhood. Others were seasoned men with white in their beards. Yet all shared the same look in their eyes: fear, defiance, and resolve. The previous night's alarms had reached them. The British were coming. To the east, along the road from Boston, redcoats marched under the command of Major John Pitcairn. Around 700 strong, they moved swiftly and in silence, their bayonets gleaming under the morning light. Their orders: seize and destroy the colonial supply caches believed to be in Concord. But more than that, they were to send a message that rebellion would not be tolerated. As the British force neared Lexington, the sound of fife and drum gave way to heavy silence. The mist had yet to lift from the grass when they spotted the small militia force standing on the town green. It was a quiet, almost surreal scene. Fewer than 80 colonial farmers standing in loose formation, facing a force nearly 10 times their number. Captain Parker knew they could not win this fight, not in open ground. He had no orders to initiate battle, only to make a symbolic stand. He turned to his men and said the words that would echo through history: "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The British troops, upon seeing the militia, halted. Major Pitcairn, mounted on horseback, rode forward and demanded the colonists disperse immediately. His voice was commanding but not yet hostile. Captain Parker, understanding the futility of resistance, gave the signal for his men to begin withdrawing. But then, in that moment of tension, it happened. A single shot rang out. To this day, no one knows who fired first. Some claimed it was a nervous colonist discharging accidentally. Others believe it came from the British ranks. Perhaps it was from a hidden onlooker, an eager spark to ignite the flame. But the shot shattered the silence, and with it, restraint vanished. What followed was chaos. British soldiers, startled and then enraged, opened fire. Some fired at the retreating colonists. Others bayoneted men who hesitated to run. Smoke filled the air as muskets cracked. Within minutes, 8 Americans lay dead on the green, their blood staining the spring grass. Another 10 were wounded. The redcoats stood over the fallen, their discipline momentarily lost in the heat of the moment. Captain Parker was among the wounded, cursing under his breath. The colonists, outmatched and overwhelmed, had fled in every direction, but their resolve had not been broken. The British had won the green, but they had lit the fire of war. The brief skirmish at Lexington may have lasted no more than 2 or 3 minutes, but its implications were immeasurable. For the first time, British soldiers had shed American blood on American soil in open conflict. No longer was this about protest, petitions, or dump tea. It was revolution now. The British commanders, however, had little time to reflect. Their orders demanded they move on to Concord. So, with bayonets fixed and ranks reformed, they marched westward, their boots crunching over the gravel in silence in their wake. Back in Lexington, townsfolk began to emerge from hiding. Mothers knelt beside fallen sons. The Reverend Jonas Clark, whose home had housed John Hancock and Samuel Adams the night before, now walked the green in silence, his heart heavy with grief. Nearby children cried as fathers were carried from the field. But even in mourning, something powerful stirred. The townspeople, shocked and enraged, began sending fresh messengers to surrounding villages. The cry was spreading like wildfire. "They've fired upon us! They've killed our men!" Up in the hills, church bells rang furiously. Riders galloped across wooden bridges and rocky trails. The countryside was awakening, not just in alarm, but in fury. The British had crossed a line, and New England was rising. Meanwhile, among the redcoats, the march to Concord became increasingly uneasy. Officers noticed civilians moving through fields with muskets. Farmhouses along the route had doors ajar, and behind those doors, barrels were being loaded, powder flasks filled. The British were no longer simply marching to seize weapons, they were marching into the jaws of resistance. Back in Lexington, Captain Parker, though wounded, refused to retreat from the fight. He gathered the remaining able-bodied men and began reorganizing them. His pain was great, but his anger was greater. "They'll pay," he muttered. "They'll pay before the sun sets." The sun was still low on the horizon, yet already the day had changed the world. For the British, what began as a mission of control had become a march into defiance. For the Americans, what began as a peaceful stance for rights had turned into war. Lexington would be remembered not for its size or strategy, but for what it symbolized, the first drop of blood in the fight for independence. From the smoke on the green rose a new conviction that the colonies would no longer kneel. The price would be high. The road ahead uncertain, but the path was set. The revolution had begun, and it started with a single shot, a shot heard round the world. The road to Concord, a surprising counterattack the morning of April 19, 1775. In Concord, Massachusetts, began like any other, except for a growing tension that clung to the air like mist over the fields. The church bells had rung at first light. Riders panting, mud-splattered, eyes ablaze, had galloped through the hamlets with warnings from Lexington. "The regulars are coming. Shots have been fired." The town's militia, still shaking off sleep and disbelief, gathered on the village green and then marched to secure the key targets the British had come for, particularly the North Bridge. Captain Isaac Davis, from the neighboring town of Acton, had arrived earlier with his company of marksmen, their cartridge boxes full and their flintlocks in top condition. He was young, barely 30, but respected. His voice was calm but resolute as he spoke to the other officers. "If we are to fight," he said quietly, "let it be for something more than powder." Meanwhile, on the Boston Road, Colonel Francis Smith was trying to maintain control over his 700 redcoats. The long march from Boston had left them winded and disoriented. At Concord, Smith split his forces. Major Pitcairn led a detachment into the town to search for munitions while a smaller group was sent to secure the North Bridge. Unbeknownst to them, militia companies were arriving by the minute, not just from Concord and Acton but from Sudbury, Lincoln, and Bedford. Smoke curled upward in the distance. Someone had set fire to supplies found in the village, or so it appeared from the hill. To the gathering colonial militias on Punkatusset Hill, it looked like the British were burning Concord. A fierce discussion broke out among the colonial officers. "They mean to destroy our homes," one man shouted. "Shall we stand and watch?" Major John Buttrick stepped forward. "We march," he said, eyes fixed on the bridge below, "but we do not fire unless fired upon." Captain Davis and his men led the column down the slope, their bayonets gleaming in the sun. The British soldiers stationed at the bridge were startled to see hundreds of armed colonists advancing with purpose and silence. They fumbled into position. No one knew exactly what would happen, but history was already in motion. When the Minutemen were within 50 yards of the bridge, a single shot rang out, no one knows from where. Then came a scattered volley from the British. Captain Davis fell, shot through the heart, the first officer to die that day. A man from Acton cried out and returned fire. Then another and another. The colonists, without orders, unleashed their fury. The skirmish lasted mere minutes, but when the smoke cleared, the bridge belonged to the militia. The British had fallen back, shocked by the ferocity of the resistance. Suddenly the world had changed. In the village center, Major Pitcairn's men, upon hearing the gunfire from the bridge, scrambled to regroup. Smith, now wounded, was slow to act. The town that they had entered with confidence was now a trap. They began a cautious retreat, but the Americans had no intention of letting them go easily. As the redcoats marched back east, the colonial militias shadowed them from behind trees, fences, and stone walls. Every bend in the road was a potential ambush. They struck in small groups, fire, run, reload, fire again, then vanished into the woods. The British were trained for open-field warfare, not for this brutal, invisible game of cat and mouse. Near Miriam's Corner, just outside Concord, the British rear guard was suddenly overwhelmed by musket fire. The colonists had massed in larger numbers, their aim steadier, their hearts now hardened by blood and fire. British soldiers fell with every exchange, the wounded screamed. Officers barked commands that no one could hear over the musket blasts. It was no longer a search mission, it was a desperate fight for survival. In towns miles away, the news spread like wildfire. Church bells clanged, drums beat, men grabbed muskets from above hearths. Teenagers ran barefoot to join their fathers. Some had no uniforms, only powder horns, courage, and the determination not to let tyranny walk their land unchecked. By the time the British column reached the town of Lincoln, the colonists had swelled to over 1,000. Militiamen were not just shadowing the retreat, they were directing it, pushing the British down narrow lanes, over bridges, and into fields where ambush waited. At one point, British soldiers found themselves surrounded on both flanks. A ragtag group of militiamen from Woburn attacked from one side while another company from Chelmsford opened fire from behind a stone wall. The redcoats broke formation, retreating in chaos, stumbling over their dead and wounded. Smith, now pale and bleeding, ordered a final push toward Lexington. He knew they had to reach any safety, or they would be annihilated. In Lexington, just as the exhausted British stumbled into view, Salvation appeared, 1,000 reinforcements under Lord Percy, with 2 field cannons. The American militia, lacking artillery, fell back temporarily. The massive booms of the cannons echoed through the valleys, shaking windows and rattling the hearts of new volunteers. But Percy's arrival only delayed the inevitable. As the British reformed their lines and resumed the march to Boston, the militia resumed their relentless assault, sniping, harassing, harrying without pause. At Menotomy, the fiercest fighting of the day erupted. Homes were turned into forts. Women hid children in root cellars as men fired from upstairs windows. Redcoats kicked down doors, bayoneted those who resisted, and suffered brutal retaliation. In one house, an elderly man named Jason Russell stood his ground. "I am too old to run," he told his wife, then took up his musket. He was found later, pierced with bayonets, surrounded by the bodies of British and colonial dead. The British line dissolved into panic more than once, only saved by the discipline of Percy's artillery and the fading daylight. As evening fell, the battered British finally limped into Charlestown and the relative safety of the Royal Navy's guns. They had marched 40 miles, lost 73 men, and left 174 wounded and 26 missing. The Americans had lost 49 men, but morale was soaring. The countryside was alive. Roads were jammed with militia still arriving. Ammunition wagons clattered toward Concord. Women carried bandages and bread to the fields. The British had set out to suppress rebellion. Instead, they had ignited war. That night, the flames of resistance were no longer flickering. They roared across Massachusetts. British officers rode in stunned disbelief. American leaders, from Samuel Adams to George Washington, understood the meaning. Compromise was dying. A new path had begun, carved in blood, echoing with musket fire from the fields of Concord. The revolution had arrived. The bloody road back to Boston, the red morning mist over Concord, had barely cleared when the British regulars, defeated and disoriented, began their retreat. Their mission to seize weapons had failed, but worse than failure was the humiliation. The proud soldiers of the king, forced to turn back by mere farmers, were about to learn that the road back to Boston would not be a retreat, it would be a nightmare. The path they had marched so confidently only hours before now became a deadly corridor. The countryside, once silent, had awoken. The alarm bells from every town had summoned militiamen, and they came flooding in from Lincoln, from Bedford, from Sudbury, and beyond. They took to the woods and stone walls lining the road, their muskets loaded, their hands steady, their hearts burning with fury. General Percy, who had been sent from Boston to rescue the retreating troops, finally met them near Lexington. What he saw shook him: exhausted, wounded men, their ammunition nearly gone, and panic threatening to spread. His reinforcements now formed a rearguard, buying time for the retreating column, but even the reinforcements could not fully halt the fury raining from the trees and fences. From Miriam's Corner, the first shots of the retreat were fired. There was no open battlefield here, no formal lines. The British marched in columns, but death came from the shadows. Colonial militiamen fired from behind trees, vanished, then reappeared farther down the road. It was a war of ghosts, one the British had never been trained to fight. The British soldiers, baking under the spring sun in their heavy wool uniforms, began to sweat and curse and bleed. At every turn they were harassed by colonial fire. Rocks flew from stone walls, musket balls cracked through air, and cries of the wounded echoed through the countryside. At the bloody angle, a sharp curve in the road near Lincoln, the ambush intensified. Colonial militias had positioned themselves perfectly, pouring crossfire into the British ranks. Redcoats fell in groups, writhing, gasping. The road was soon littered with bodies, pools of blood seeping into the Massachusetts earth. A British sergeant shouted to his men to press on, but his words were cut short by a shot through his throat. Another officer tried to rally the flank but was struck in the chest. Panic gripped the ranks. Some broke formation and ran, only to be gunned down by colonials waiting just ahead. Back in Boston, the citizens had no idea of the scale of disaster unfolding. Smoke still hung in the air from musket fire miles away, but the horror was yet to reach the city. Wives waited for their husbands. Children stared out at the roads. British officers in the city kept calm facades, but their hands trembled. By mid-afternoon, the British column was a shambled mass of soldiers, many wounded, all demoralized. The road passed through Menotomy, what is now Arlington, and the fighting reached its most brutal point. Men shot from windows, from rooftops, from behind hedges. In retaliation, the British fired into homes. Civilians were caught in the carnage. Fires broke out, screams filled the village. It was no longer war, it was slaughter. Here, the oldest militiamen and the youngest alike joined the fray. A father and son team took up positions behind a shed, firing in tandem. A black freedman, once a servant in Concord, fought side by side with white farmers. An old man, too frail to walk far, sat on his porch and loaded muskets for the boys running by. This was no longer just a rebellion of provinces, it was the rage of a people. British discipline, forged in years of European battlefields, was unraveling by the minute. The soldiers, thirsty, bleeding, disoriented, were desperate just to survive. General Percy had to make brutal decisions, burning homes that might harbor snipers, shooting those who resisted, even executing his own men for desertion. But it was no use. For every militiaman killed, 3 more arrived. The colonial strategy was never about a grand victory. It was death by 1,000 cuts, wound after wound, body after body, fear stacked on fear. And slowly, the British realized they were not suppressing rebellion, they were feeding it. As dusk approached, the Redcoats finally reached Charlestown, where British naval boats awaited them. The survivors stumbled aboard, too exhausted even to speak. Blood caked their boots. Many had no hats, no packs, just the shock of survival on their faces. In total, the British suffered nearly 300 casualties that day. The colonials, too, had losses, but they bore them as sacrifices on the altar of liberty. The names of the fallen Jonathan Harrington, James Miller, Isaac Davis were already being whispered as martyrs in town meetings and prayers. The British commanders reported the day as a regrettable skirmish, but no one believed that. The events on the road from Concord to Boston had ignited something far greater than a mere clash. It was the birth of war. That night, Boston was sealed off. No one went in or out. Tensions spiked. The city became a powder keg, British ships patrolling the harbor, colonial spies swarming the outskirts. People whispered of independence, of revenge, of war. And in taverns from Massachusetts to Virginia, men raised their glasses and repeated the same solemn truth: the war has begun. More than just a battle, the smoke had dissipated over the meadows of Lexington and the bridges of Concord, but its scent still lingered in the nostrils of those who had witnessed it. In the towns and hamlets of Massachusetts, the echoes of gunfire reverberated far beyond the battlefield. For the colonists, April 19, 1775, would forever be remembered. Not merely as a day of violence, but as the turning point of a destiny they had only dared to imagine. The survivors of that day did not return to quiet homes. They returned to families trembling with questions, to mothers clutching their children tightly, and to fathers standing with newly firm resolve. The wounds on their bodies were less painful than the knowledge that the line had finally been crossed. There was no more peace to hope for under the rule of King George. In Boston, the British returned with losses far greater than anticipated. Nearly 300 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Their bright red uniforms, once symbols of imperial power, were now tattered, blood-stained, and fearsome reminders of resistance. General Gage, upon receiving the grim report, stood in silence for a long time. He knew now, this was not a minor skirmish. This was a rebellion in the making. On the colonial side, the news spread like wildfire. Riders galloped through New England, not just warning of British troops, but announcing that the people had risen. From Vermont to Connecticut, farmers laid down plows and picked up muskets. The legend of Lexington and Concord did more than inspire. It united. In the meeting houses of the countryside, whispers turned into speeches. In candlelit gatherings, men swore oaths beside fireplaces, pledging to defend not just their land, but the ideals that had quietly taken root for years: liberty, self-rule, and dignity. The blood spilled by 8 men in Lexington was no longer just blood, it had become a banner. Paul Revere, though arrested briefly during his ride, was released and returned to Boston a changed man. His midnight journey was no longer just a warning. It had become folklore. He spoke of it not with pride, but with urgency, knowing that the story was no longer about individuals, but about a people awakening. In Concord, the townsfolk gathered at the North Bridge days after the fighting. There, ministers spoke solemnly beside the waters still flowing beneath the now historic bridge. The townspeople cleaned the battlefield and buried the dead British and American alike. Reverend William Emerson, grandfather of future poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, said simply, "Freedom has found its voice in musket fire, and now it must be heard through unity." Back in Philadelphia, where the Second Continental Congress was soon to convene, News of the fighting arrived with breathless messengers. John Adams was among the first to receive the report. He read it aloud to a small gathering, his voice quivering, not with fear, but with the weight of history pressing down. "The die is cast," he said. "There is no turning back." Voices of moderation, like John Dickinson's, still urged caution, still hoped for reconciliation. But each passing day, with each funeral held and each musket polished, made the call for independence louder. Even Benjamin Franklin, ever the pragmatist, knew the clock of peace was fast running out. And across the sea in London, the news stirred anger and confusion. Parliament debated endlessly. The King George III, upon hearing of the defiance, declared the colonies to be in open rebellion. More troops would be sent. More force would be applied. But the empire underestimated something critical, the spirit of a people who had tasted courage. Throughout New England, militias transformed into organized armies. Farmers became soldiers. Blacksmiths forged bayonets. Women sewed uniforms and rolled bandages. Teenagers who had never held a weapon before stood beside weathered veterans from the French and Indian War. The call had gone out not for battle alone, but for nationhood. Among those answering that call was a young man named Nathaniel from New Hampshire. Just 19, he left behind his family farm, kissed his younger sister goodbye, and promised his mother he'd write. "If I fall," he said, "let it be for something worth more than a single life." He would join thousands making their way toward Cambridge, where the provincial army was gathering, preparing for a siege on Boston. From that day forward, nothing was the same. Lexington and Concord were not merely towns, they had become symbols. Their meadows and roads were now sacred ground. In them, the first cries of revolution had taken shape, no longer theoretical in pamphlets or philosophical musings, but real, fought with flintlocks and paid for in blood. As spring turned to summer, General George Washington would arrive to take command of the Continental Army. But the spirit he would inherit had already been born not in grand speeches, but in quiet resolve. Not on marble steps, but on muddy fields. The revolution had begun, not with declarations, but with decisions made by ordinary people standing their ground. And so, when the sun set over Massachusetts each evening, its light cast long shadows over graves newly dug, over bridges scarred by battle, and over a people who no longer looked to London for answers. They looked to each other, because in that moment they had become something else. Not merely colonists, not merely rebels, but Americans. And that, more than any musket fired or regiment marched, was what would change the world.